I have sat with dying people for 40 years. I have been in the room when the last breath came, and I have held the hands of people who thought they were alone. I mention this not to draw attention to myself, but because I want you to understand that I am not a man who is easily undone. Grief is not dramatic. It is quiet and patient, and it waits in rooms you don't expect. The room I did not expect was the dining room of the Aldermore Park Hotel on the 14th of March, at noon, at a charity luncheon for the Hartwell Children's Trust. I had been a patron of the trust for 11 years. My wife Irene set that in motion before she died, and I kept the subscription going because it seemed the right thing to do, and because Irene had been right about most things. The luncheon was an annual fixture, a pleasant enough affair in a pleasant enough room, the kind where you know 4 people well, nod at 6 more, and spend the remainder of the time being courteous to strangers over bread rolls. The Aldermore Park was a decent provincial hotel, the sort that still pressed its napkins and kept real flowers on the sideboards. There was a small upright piano in the far corner of the dining room, near the window that looked out over the garden, and I had never once in 11 years heard anyone play it. I noticed Ada crisp the way you notice furniture that has always been there, which is to say, I noticed her barely. She was a woman in her middle 50s, I would guess, with dark hair shot through with gray pulled back neatly at the nape, and she wore the pale blue blouse of the hotel's dining staff. She moved between the tables with a coffee urn and a practiced quietness, the kind of quietness that takes years to develop and that most people in that room would never think to admire. She had a still quality about her, a steadiness of movement, and her hands, which I noticed for no particular reason, perhaps the habit of a doctor, were long-fingered and very calm. Desmond Call I noticed immediately, in the way that you notice a sound that is slightly too loud for the room it occupies. He was a visiting music critic of some standing, according to the Trust printed program, an adjudicator for several regional competitions, a man of opinions that he wore the way other men wear watches, visibly, and with the assumption that everyone had noticed. He was seated 2 tables from me, and he had the habit of addressing the room rather than the person in front of him, as if the room were always grateful for the contribution. It was during the lull between the main course and dessert, one of those quiet intervals when the conversation has briefly exhausted itself, that Call turned in his chair and raised his voice across the room. "Excuse me," he said, aiming the words at Ada, who had just set the coffee urn down on the sideboard near the piano. "Since we have an instrument and since you're clearly not rushed, why don't you give the room something light and easy? Nothing too challenging for the help, just a cheerful little tune, something to move things along." He said it pleasantly enough. That was the thing, the pleasantness of it made it what it was. The assumption that this was a reasonable request to make of a woman carrying a coffee urn, that she was the natural entertainment for a dull moment, that she would either demur with a flustered smile or produce 3 clumsy bars of something and be forgiven for it. 2 or 3 people laughed, not unkindly, the way people laugh when someone fills a silence with something just social enough to let the moment pass. Ada did not look up immediately. She set the handle of the coffee urn down against the sideboard, straightened it by 1/4 of an inch, and then she looked across the room at Desmond Call. The look lasted no longer than 2 seconds. There was nothing defiant in it, no anger, no pride. It was simply a very direct look, the kind that takes the measure of a situation and finds it not particularly surprising. Then she walked to the piano. She pulled the stool out with one hand, angled it without looking, and sat down. The bench adjustment she made in 2 precise movements, left side, then right, with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone returning to a room they have been away from rather than visiting for the first time. Her back straightened. Her hands came up and rested, palms down, in her lap. She sat still for a moment. The room had not quite settled into expectation. There was still a murmur near the back, a scrape of a chair. Someone near me was reaching for their wine glass. Then she placed her hands on the keys. The first chord of the Schubert Wanderer Fantasy hits the way a door opens onto a storm. It is not violent, exactly, but it is enormous, and it is immediate, and it does not apologize for itself. The opening bars are marked allegro con fuoco, fast, with fire, and what came out of that small upright piano in the dining room of the Aldermore Park Hotel was a sound that had no business being there and yet filled every corner of the room with such authority that the wine glass was set down without the person who had been reaching for it quite knowing why. By the 4th bar the room was silent. Not the silence of people being polite. Not the silence of waiting to see what the joke would be. A different silence entirely, the kind that has weight to it, that pushes back when you try to think past it. The Wanderer Fantasy is not a gentle piece. It demands a player of full technical command and asks the player to mean every note, because the music knows the difference. It opens in C major with the brightness of something about to be tested and then tests it, relentlessly, over the course of that first movement, pushing the theme through keys and registers with an urgency that Schubert, who never heard the piece performed in his lifetime, seemed to understand would one day find the right room and the right silence. Ada Crisp played it from memory. There was no sheet music on the stand. Her eyes were open but focused somewhere that was not the room, or perhaps somewhere that was very much the room, a room none of us could see. She played without performance. That is the only way I know how to say it. There was no display of effort, no tossed head, none of the theatrical machinery of a professional recitalist. There was simply the music, and her hands, and the absolute conviction that this was what the moment required. I am not a musical man. I can tell you that a piece is beautiful the way I can tell you that a sunset is beautiful, accurately, and without much authority. But I can read a room. 40 years of reading faces across a consulting desk, of watching the moment when someone understands something they had been trying not to understand, that I know. And what I saw in the dining room of the Aldermore Park Hotel, in the faces of 35 people who had come to eat a charity lunch on a Thursday in March, was the particular stillness that happens when something passes through you that you were not prepared for and cannot name. Mrs. Alderton, who had been chair of the trust for 20 years and who I had never seen lose composure in any public setting, had her hand pressed flat to the table and was staring at it. The young man from the council who had given the welcome remarks was sitting forward with his elbows on his knees, his chin in his hands, like a boy at a fireside story. A woman I didn't know, somewhere behind me, made a sound very quietly, not quite a breath and not quite a word, and then was silent. Ada moved through the first movement and into the adagio, and the temperature of the room changed again. The adagio of the Wanderer fantasy is the emotional interior of the piece, the section built on the song Schubert wrote in his 20s, a song about a wanderer in winter longing for a warmth that is elsewhere, that is perhaps nowhere. In Ada's hands it became something I have no clinical language for. It was a grief played with such precision and such care that it seemed less like loss than like love, the way love persists in the shape left by someone, in the chair they always sat in the particular hour of the evening when the house goes quiet and you think you hear their step in the hall and then remember. I did not weep. I am 71 years old and I have cried at two things in my adult life, which were my mother's funeral and the birth of my grandson, and I had long assumed those two events between them had finished the job. I found out in the dining room of the Aldermore Park Hotel that I was wrong about that. The piece moved through the presto and into the final allegro, and what Ada built in those last minutes was the piece returning to its opening fire, transformed, the same theme, the same urgency, but carrying everything the middle movements had laid into it, so that it arrived at its final bars not as a conclusion but as something harder and truer, the recognition that the wanderer keeps going. That is what the piece is. It is not a piece about arrival. It is a piece about the fact of continuing, which is sometimes the most difficult and the most human thing there is. The last chord landed. Ada's hands came to rest on the keys for a moment, and then she lifted them into her lap. The room did not move for what I estimate was 12 to 15 seconds. I counted, in the old habit of a man who used to time pulses. Then someone stood, Mrs. Alderton, as it happened, and then the room stood around her in ones and twos and then all together, and the applause was not the polite applause of a charity luncheon but something from further down, something people had been holding without knowing they were holding it. I looked at Desmond Call. He was the last to stand. He stood when there was nothing left to do but stand. His hands came together in front of him and he clapped, slowly, and his face was not the face he had arrived with. It was smaller, somehow. Quieter. The man who had addressed the room as though it existed to receive him was not present. What was present was a man who had asked for a cheerful little tune and been answered in a language he had spent his career pretending to understand and had just now, perhaps for the first time, actually heard. He did not speak. I don't think he had anything left. I made my way to the piano when the room had settled, because old habit meant I wanted to know she was all right. Ada was standing beside the stool, her hands folded in front of her, receiving the quiet words of the people who came to her, and there were many, with a stillness that I recognized. It is the stillness of someone who has just done something that cost them considerably and is not yet sure what they are on the other side of. I introduced myself. She thanked me for the kind words with a directness that told me she was not entirely present yet. I asked, because I am a doctor and it is the question I always ask, whether she was all right. She considered that for a moment. She had the manner of a person who takes questions seriously. My husband called that piece The Wanderer, she said. He said it was the only piece of music that told the truth about what it is to keep moving when you don't know where you're going. She paused. He died 6 years ago. I haven't played since the night I lost him. She said it plainly, the way people tell the true things, without emphasis, without the framing that asks you to respond in a particular way. She said it and waited to see what I would do with it. I am a man who has spent 40 years knowing what to say. I have delivered the worst news a person can receive, across a desk in a small room, hundreds of times, and I have learned that what matters is not the words but the steadiness behind them, the willingness to stay in the difficulty alongside the person rather than moving to tidy it away. I found that I had nothing. Not because the situation defeated me, but because nothing was required. She had already said the thing. She had already done the harder thing, the thing with the piano, the 12-second silence, the room of 35 strangers who would drive home that afternoon changed in some way they would be unable to explain to the people they came home to. Ada Crisp had carried that piece in her hands for 6 years, and she had set it down in a dining room in March because a man with too loud a voice had handed her the chance and she had decided, in the 2 seconds of the look she gave him, that she would take it. I have sat with grief for 40 years. I thought I had learned its dimensions. I drove home in the early afternoon and I sat in the chair by the window, Irene's chair, which I had not moved, and I sat there for a long while, watching the garden go pale in the thinning light. I was not thinking of anything in particular. I was listening to the aftersound of the music, which had not quite left the room I carry inside myself, and which I suspect, if I am honest, will not entirely go. There are pieces of music and there are people who play them, and occasionally, rarely, the music and the person are the same thing. What Ada Crisp played that afternoon in the Aldermore Park Hotel was not a performance. It was a reckoning. And it was a resumption. She had not arrived somewhere. She had simply remembered that she was still going. The wanderer keeps moving. That is the whole of it. That is all there is.